I'm Tom Covert. I'm an assistant professor at the business school here. Thanks so much for coming to the first of our seminar series for the spring quarter here. Today we're super excited about the work we're going to be hearing about today related to energy market design for a greening grid. To sort of give you a little bit of context for what we're going to hear about today, it's a really important theme to be keeping in mind is the fact that a lot of the energy in the United States now comes from renewable resources. In fact, there's some evidence that suggests it's doubled in the last decade, and that's going to create some interesting challenges for regulators and market designers in the electricity markets that these power sources are going to be feeding into. We're really lucky to have today somebody who's probably one of the world experts on dealing with this problem, especially from a market design perspective. This is Matt White, who is the chief economist at ISO New England. At ISO New England, Matt is responsible for designing and developing markets for electricity, and including sort of baseload power and renewable power that in total end up being about $10 billion a year of transactions. So he's certainly got some interesting experience that we'll be hearing about in our presentation today. Prior to being at ISO New England, Matt was a professor here, as well as at Stanford and the University of Pennsylvania. And in all of those places, Matt, in addition to doing some great research, got teaching prizes for his great work in teaching students. In addition to his research work and his policy work, Matt has also worked in a variety of government institutions related to energy markets, including FERC, and the Federal Trade Commission, and he's also been an advisor to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Matt, we're so happy to have you here. It's been a couple years in the making. Really excited to hear what you got to say.
Thank you so much. I think with that wonderful introduction and accolades, I'm afraid things can only go downhill from here, but I'll try to do enough of a living up to your expectations to hopefully get invited back. It's a pleasure to be back at the University of Chicago. When I got started as a rookie assistant professor about 30 years ago, a new field in economics was just emerging. It's now called market design. One of the leading applications of market design in those intervening years has been to electricity markets. They now run about 60% of the grid across the United States and in much of the countries around the world. But very recently, the emergence of new technologies in renewable energy and the policies that are promoting them have posed a whole lot of new challenges for these market designs. And sometimes what works beautifully in economic theory, you learn, sometimes a little late, doesn't quite work that way in practice. What I thought would be interesting to share with you tonight are some of my observations on these challenges. And I've structured this through the course of 3 real-life examples that I've worked through. I can't say worked through, that's a little too strong. Let me explain that in a moment. I'm going to talk about congestion pricing and how renewable energy is changing or complicating that, and how we've tried to address it. I'll then talk about the information economics of wind forecasting. It's a subject that economists spend a great deal of time thinking about, information economics, but to an application that makes people go, huh. And you'll see why those two are closely connected in a moment, a little bit farther along. Last, I want to talk about something near and dear to people who truly like Gary Becker and core price theory will explain everything, which is how do you coordinate production with prices on really, really tight timescales in a world where you have a rapidly growing solar fleet that doesn't care about the price of power. Now, I've structured these a little bit so that the first of these examples I think it was a little bit of a success story at integrating renewables into the markets a little more efficiently, though it was not without its humbling moments, as I'll explain. But these other two, the second and third, are really very much more open, outstanding questions that remain ripe for research. And in sort of, I'll try to structure this in a way, I won't have the answers really to 2 and 3, but I'll try to structure it in a crisp enough way that you can see the problems, and hopefully in doing so, spur your own thinking about how they might be addressed. Before delving into substance, just a little bit of background about my company. We were founded exactly 20 years ago this spring. We now have about 600 employees. One of our central responsibilities is that we design and we administer a suite of auction-based electricity markets. In these markets, participants buy and sell everything ranging from long, multi-year complex forward contracts for future deliveries of electricity to very short spot energy transactions for something to be delivered within the next 5 minutes. We are a central counterparty to all of the trades that take place in these markets. In addition, we actually coordinate all of the physical flows of electricity across the power grid throughout all of New England, the 6 states through which we operate. And that's intentional. That allows us to enable any buyer or seller in these auctions who wants to go to physical delivery to do so. We back the trade. You can get the power if you want it. We're your counterparty. We will assure it happens. And we will find someone else to produce it to cover your transaction, whether it's done 3 years in advance or whether it's done 5 minutes ago. Who's actually in this? These are all wholesale markets. These are markets for billions of dollars with large buyers and sellers. And the reality is, it's not Oliver who's buying and selling power in our markets, though if you have $5 million in initial collateral, you're welcome to join. Basically, you can think of these as large energy users, an industry who uses enough electricity that it's worth their time to buy wholesale volumes. Local distribution utilities and retailers. New England is a region that has retail choice. It's fairly competitive in most of those states. Those entities don't own power plants. They buy almost all of the electricity that they resell through these markets. Power plant owners, this is a deregulated part of the country in the power industry, at least for the power plant owners. They derive almost all of their revenue, both long-term and short-term, from prices from either transactions in our markets or under contracts that settle against the prices in these markets. And last, there are financial institutions who buy and sell power and engage in lots of financial transactions in these markets, both to provide risk-sharing services to the other participants and also just to arbitrage prices in the markets. So with that as a little bit of background, let's talk about congestion pricing. And really, this is trying to figure out how do you get wind power to be more efficient. So as many of you know, there are lots of potential applications, got to use the words right, for congestion pricing. Roads, communications and power networks, airport landing slots, and so on. Unfortunately, sadly, most applications of congestion pricing really remain just in the textbooks because policymakers remain so reluctant to actually put a congestion price on the roads and make consumers be that much further away from using the roads for free at the margin. But there is a bright spot, which is electricity markets, where we have had a very dynamic, real-time set of congestion pricing in place for almost 15 years ago. Almost 15 years, went in 15 years ago. What I want to do now is give you a couple slides that explains how that works, to illustrate it for you. And then once I've illustrated how it works in general, I'm going to talk about what we learned when renewable energy in the form of wind power came to town. And it exposed some gaps in our thinking about how market design works. Ah, yes. When I was setting this up, I first thought, well, let me explain how congestion and networks work. This is the real network, part of it, from the perspective of an engineer. And we have lots of engineers. And then I thought, that is going to be really complicated. Maybe not. How about, in honor of being at Chicago, we'll think about that network the way an economist would think about it, which is more like this. Okay. So to narrate this, I'm going to imagine there are only 2 locations instead of the umpteen thousand that you previously saw. We'll call them, cleverly, A and B. Over at A, there's a lot of cheap supply. And over at B, there is demand from homes and businesses, and there's also some expensive supply. Key thing I want you to observe is what's in the middle, which is there's one connection between A and B, and it has a limited capacity, which I'll call K in the graphs that come up. And to be the interesting case, I'm going to assume that that K, that limit on capacity, is sufficiently low that not all demand can be met by the cheap supply. Some of it can, but then the line gets congested, and the rest has to be met by expensive supply. To make this look further like a little bit of economics, I'm going to add a lot of supply and demand curves. They're color-coded to make this look as easy as it actually is. So supply at A will be in red. I'm assuming these, say, two firms offer in at two different prices, and this is the aggregate supply curve at A. At B, there's a nice linear downward sloping demand curve. And also at B, there's a much steeper, more expensive upward sloping supply curve. Okay? Now, congestion pricing in this context is something that's like, it's like 1 week past what we teach in Economics 101. Right? We just never get there when we normally teach it. But the idea actually doesn't look any different than the economics of a quota or a tariff. So just to narrate a little bit, again, I've got the supply at A in red, price in the vertical, quantity in the horizontal as usual. I've constructed a residual demand curve at B in blue. So what that means is take the demand curve from the consumers and subtract off sort of horizontally the supply of the expensive suppliers. We're essentially asking at every price, how much would consumers want to buy, minus how much would be supplied by the expensive suppliers also at B. It's a residual demand curve because in the sense it's asking what is the amount that would be demanded by those consumers from the suppliers at A at that price, demand that's not met by the local suppliers at B. Okay? And that's the nice thing about doing in two nodes. I can collapse things into residual demand curves so we can make things look like they normally do in economics. I want you to note the line limit is here. When supply goes from suppliers at A, reaches that line limit, we say that line limit is congested. Right? That's just terminology that goes with the scarce network being at its maximum capacity between any 2 points. So prices are the interesting point to look at. In an efficient equilibrium, there will be two prices. And they both follow price equals marginal cost. Nothing new so far, right? At A, price at A is set by marginal offer at A. At B, the price will be set by the marginal offer at B, which in this example you can think of as being the marginal expensive supplier that's being used at B. It could also be by demand. In a nice simple world like this, those are both equal at B. There's a nice piece of this, and this is now getting back to congestion. There is extra revenue left over in this world. So for the K units that are produced by the suppliers at A, they're getting paid price A. But those units are getting consumed by the consumers at B who are paying price PB. So when we settle markets, there's money left over. That money we call the congestion revenue. In a textbook, they'd be called congestion rents. But when I'm talking outside a university to people in the real world, rents doesn't carry the same connotation that it does to economists, so we use the word congestion revenue. And in an efficient outcome, you know where that money should go? To the people who built the line, right? To the line owners. That's the return on investment. Now, if you look at all this, I've done this in front of regulators, and boy, I get confused looks and like, boy, this looks deep, and this is going to take me places maybe I don't want to do, like I got to put taxes on roads. But no, it's not tax, it's congestion price. It's different, not the same thing. But if you're an economist, I mean, you just imagine, right? I mean, this looks great. There's like efficiency at every intersection, right? I mean, in the short run, the sellers at A got the right incentives to produce, and at B, the consumers and the sellers at B have the right incentives. Nobody wants to do anything that would overtax that line limit, so it respects the network. There's incentives to invest at A and B in different locations that reflect the marginal value of new supply. And key to what's going to come later, there's actually a price signal to expand the network, right? Because that price difference, the congestion price, PB minus PA, accrues to this seller. And at the margin, if they can expand the network at a cost, just a second, less than PB minus A, they have every incentive to do so. So this looks nice.
But it only accrues to them if there's congestion, right? So if
Correct. It's a marginal argument. You are making a great observation about where does it stop. Yeah. That actually depends whether there can be competition for another person to add the line. Exactly. Yeah, that's a more subtle argument. Let me put that off a little bit because that'll take us into a longer discussion right now. Now, what's not in the textbooks is how do you find those prices? Right? If you go and you actually try to explain this to engineers, or actually have any economics training, they look at you and like, So like, how do you find PB and PA? Does like Leon Walras himself, this is a joke for the PhD economics students, actually like walk out behind a computer and say, the prices, they are PA, PB, there you go, and you're done, right? And no, the real world doesn't work that way. This is where market design comes in. Somebody has to design institutions, rules, and procedures to help the market find PA and PB. And that is one of the things that we do. So let me give you a little quick synopsis. We use auctions to do this, of how the auctions work in the real world. This will be cursory, because I want to talk about congestion pricing again, and then I'll come back and do more details on how the auctions work, because people love knowing about auctions. But a cursory version is the sellers at A and B make offers to buy or sell power. They can, typically they'll submit them every hour. Some of them will do it much faster. The demanders, it comes in much faster than that. We run an auction that's designed to maximize the gains from trade, subject to the network limits. We know the real network. We know all that map. We have a mathematical model of it. We clear the market in discrete time every 5 minutes. The prices will typically vary because demand actually does vary every 5 minutes. And it's for immediate delivery, which means if you're a seller at A and you cleared 10 units right now, you're expected to produce at your plant 10 units for the next 5 minutes, right now, for which you will be paid the price I just announced. And in 5 minutes, we'll clear again, and maybe you'll get 12 units, and you'll be expected to produce 12 units for the next 5 minutes. And they really do this. There are 350 power plants, and they move every 5 minutes, boop, 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 all the way along, as do the prices. Price is set, same logic as I had. It's by the marginal bid and offer for delivery to every location. This is one of the only terms in the entire electricity industry that makes logical sense. It's locational, because every price could be different. It is marginal, set by the marginal bid or offer, and it's a price. Always plural, because they're always different. Okay. If you like math, we actually do this using duality theory. I'm going to skip over that for the Q&A. I can talk about that all day, but that really puts people to sleep. Let me note, because this is going to be important, it's going to come later. We also have a forward day-ahead market. It is essentially the exact same auction system, but it's done just once the day before for all time periods the next day. It uses essentially exactly the same format. It will also produce congestion prices using the exact same logic. Like almost all commodity markets, almost all volume trades in the forward market. Okay, that's true in metals, it's true in agricultural commodities and everything else, because prices are less volatile trading forward, so there's less risk to both parties. Okay. And these really become the balancing markets because the forward positions cash settle out at those real-time prices. In all commodity market design, the efficiency or lack thereof is derived entirely from the efficiency of the spot market, and then you work backwards. So the spot prices have to work right. What happens in the real world? Here's a nice example. This is a hot day with congestion pricing. So just to narrate the color map up there, that is a map of New England, except the top part of Maine has been cut off on this particular chart. Actually, the top of Maine is nothing but woods, and the actual transmission grid literally stops about 2/3 of the way up Maine. Like there is nothing, that's it. That's the end of the power system. So it's without loss of generality to not show quite the top of Maine. The colors, so Vermont, New Hampshire, obviously the top center, Massachusetts in the middle. You can see Boston, just to give you a reference point, I put the little dot on Boston. Manhattan is right down here, my bottom left. The colors indicate the price of electricity at this particular point in time. This is 1310. We work in that kind of time for those 5 minutes. The blue is where the price was low in most of Maine. The price was down in single digits. We measure prices in dollars per megawatt hour. That's you use at home dollars per kilowatt hour. But for present purposes, think about the differences. The difference is prices in Maine are $1 to single digit dollars. When you get down near Boston and it's red, getting up to brown, those prices were more than $1,000 per megawatt hour. Okay? And this difference here between where it's almost $1 and where it's almost 1,000, that's about 40 miles, which to an electron is nothing. Right? It's right there. Okay. Question for you. Easy question, not a rhetorical question. Where do you think most of the wind at this time had been built in New England? Maybe just humor me and point. Go ahead. Yeah. Up there. You got it. And it couldn't get out. Okay. And where do you think policymakers today have seen the most value in pushing solar development? In the southern states, right? Because this is kind of typical what happens on a hot day. Okay, so prices really do signal economic activity. It works. But this was after we figured out how to deal with getting wind power into the market in an efficient way and getting the congestion pricing to work right with wind. It didn't at first. Let me show you a little about why. Okay. Oh, look at that. I forgot about that. I'm going to change my example, but I'm going to keep the right-hand side of this. Everything at B is unchanged. On the left-hand side, I'm going to replace my old fossil-fired power plants with wind supply. As before, residual demand at the right is the same. At the left, we're now going to focus on what happened in the supply behavior of the wind participants, and particularly in the pricing. That's actually what we're going to focus on. So in the Precambrian era of wind development, which is to say more than 5 years ago, we saw the following problems with wind producers. They didn't actively participate in any of these auctions. They just produced when the wind blows, whatever the wind would let them blow. Now, they're still getting paid. If they put power onto the grid, they're getting paid the 5-minute spot price, but they're acting as pure price takers. They're not actually submitting any bids. The third bullet will be very important in a moment. We still have to make sure that they don't burn down a transmission line and cause a blackout. So we would tell them in advance, typically hourly, they had some limits on their production. So if the wind is really good for this next hour, you can't go above this. There were a whole lot of non-price rationing rules. For purposes of example, let's just think of it as pro rata. So if I have 2 wind farms, that's what I had in the previous graph, imagine each was told you can't go more than K over 2 each. Because that way if they're both producing K over 2, the line stays at K. Okay. Told that in advance. If you think about this for a minute, there's at least one obvious problem, which is now we're rationing that scarce network capacity, but we're not doing it on the basis of willingness to pay. Now, that might be a problem, depending on whether willingness to sell is the same or not. There's another issue which is not so obvious, which is what happens to the congestion revenue now, and who gets it? Does the line owner still get it? And if you're at this point thinking, that doesn't seem very obvious, Matt, that's okay, because this was not obvious to us either for an embarrassingly long time. And this is real money. This is a phenomenon called congestion capture. So again, the blue downward sloping demand line is unchanged before. That's residual demand at location B. The wind suppliers, remember what they're doing, they're just blowing with the wind, right, as much as they can, but they got this limit of K over 2 each. They're told a priori. In this example, let me assume it's a really good wind day. They'd like to produce as much as they can, so they both go to K over 2, so total supply is K. It is perfectly inelastic, right? They're totally price takers. It doesn't matter what it is, that's what they're going to do. So I've done that in the usual way that as an economist, we'd think about the wind supplier's behavior, which is it's flat out at say 0, and then vertical here. If you think about what prices the auction would produce at B, again, it's easy. The marginal offer at B is the expensive supplier at B, who sets the price PB at his marginal cost, say, or at least technically I could say it's the marginal offer of the supplier at B. That's not changed. But what happened in practice was the price at A was also the same as the price at B. And as we saw more and more wind power coming in to distant places like Maine, where the transmission system was a little thin, we saw this more and more often. And if you think about it from an economic perspective, this might strike you as odd, because this line is at its maximum capacity. It is congested. But the congestion price, which is the difference between the payment price at A and the payment price at B, is 0. So the congestion price is 0. And to my economist colleagues and I, we kept saying, this is our economics version of Shakespeare. To paraphrase Hamlet, something seems rotten. Smells rotten, is that right? In the state of Denmark, in the state of Maine, in our case, right? So, so here's a real life story. I couldn't figure this out, but everything is complicated, and it always takes lots of people in the real world to figure anything out. So we got together a team, and which team of people who work on stuff like this with me is a bunch of economists and a bunch of people with degrees in operations research. They actually write the algorithms to do this stuff. You remember that big network? It's like 300 optimization variables and 4,000 constraints to set prices every 5 minutes. And by the way, it has to solve that fast, faster than I can snap my finger. Economists don't do that. Guys who have PhDs in algorithms do that, right? And then the software engineers who write everything, who outnumber all the people like us by about a factor of 10 to 1 when you're going to get a real project done. So they're clearly the most productive people in the company, as far as I can tell. And we had to think about this. And what we discovered was the following point. This will be the sort of the only mathematically preview flag. This will be the only mathematically subtle part of the talk. Mike Greenstone said this has to be a general interest talk, but he said, but it's Chicago, so it should be general interest, but all about economics. But general interest I took to mean no equations. So I'm going to have to explain something without equations that's a little mathematical. Here's the issue. We didn't actually model the constraint in the clearing process. So when we were setting up how the market should clear, in this case, we knew the wind producers will never produce more than K. We had a little separate thing that checked it first. So if you know they're not going to produce K, and you're running an optimization algorithm to produce the efficient outcome, you don't need to tell the market clearing process, enforce a limit of K. It's already been enforced on their behavior. They're only going to produce K. So if you don't put the constraint in the auction, what happens? The actual market clearing process says, there's no constraint here at all in my software. If there's no constraint at all, then supply at A and supply B, it's the same thing. There's no reason to differentiate between the two. If there's no difference between between two products that are being delivered at the same time, then what do we know from economics? The law of one price must prevail, which is exactly what happened. See the same price everywhere, right? If you like a little more technical explanation, if you don't formally model a constraint in an optimization problem, it's not possible to find the shadow price associated with that constraint. Or implicitly, the shadow price will be 0 because the constraint doesn't exist. If there's no shadow price on that constraint, there will be no price separation on either side of the constraint. So you'll always get PA equals PB. What we were doing to save ourselves time in running the market clearing process, these auctions, with hundreds of choice variables and hundreds of bids and thousands of constraints, is not modeling any constraint we didn't need to get the efficient outcomes in terms of quantities, which this does. This is the efficient outcome in terms of quantities. But if you don't do things like put all those constraints in, you don't get the efficient outcome in terms of prices. In fact, you would get a price of PA equals B, law of one price obtains, even though this scarce asset, K, is being used to its maximum capacity. And a little bit more capacity would have more value, at least if the wind could produce more than K. Its value would be PB over PA minus this. Sorry, PB minus 0. We were seeing the wrong price signal to invest in wind. Who gets the congestion revenue here? Not a trick question. A, the line owner. B, the wind farms. Go ahead. A is the line owner. B is the wind farms. The wind farms have captured all the congestion. The line owner, for this purpose, was a different corporation. Do they have any incentive to expand the capacity? Nothing. No price signal. All those nice efficiency properties, they're not there. And in fact, it's almost worse than that, because now wind sees a nice price signal to invest wherever the wind is strongest, which is way up in Maine where the transmission grid is thin. Guess where we saw tons of investment? In Maine. Guess where we couldn't actually make use of the wind power often? When it's in Maine. It is real money. People make real decisions based on price signals. And if they're not right, you have lots and lots of investment that may not, or possibly should not have been occurred. This problem has occurred across the entire industry. Okay? There are lots of parts of the country where they have not implemented the fix I'm going to describe next to solve this problem. And this is why you sometimes hear people in the industry screaming out negative prices everywhere from wind. Well, it shouldn't be everywhere. It should just be where the wind is, really. Because wind should build up to the point where it congests the line, because otherwise you should put more wind in, right? Margin doesn't cost much. It took a long time for us to figure out how to do this, because it turns out it's kind of subtle to figure out how to make this all work right. You can't just put the constraint in, because they'll still have incentives to bid the same way. And you actually get indeterminate prices if you put the constraint in. It's a classic problem of what's called dual degeneracy in mathematics. The prices are actually theoretically non-unique. One thing you don't want to do if you're running an auction clearing $10 billion a year is be subject to a regulatory investigation that says, is it true, Dr. White, that the prices are not uniquely determined in your auctions and that you cleared a ton of money on this? And if so, how did you decide what is the appropriate price? Boy, that's embarrassing. I don't want to do that. Okay. So we had to figure out how to do this. Like all economists, we started with hypotheses. Hypothesis number one, the wind producers really are not willing to sell at any price. Probably willing to sell at zero, but that's not any price. We're economists. What if we made it minus infinity? I bet they wouldn't pay that. Maybe less, maybe like minus the GDP of Africa. Bet they won't do that. Let's work our way up, okay? We did 3 design changes then to try to make this work. One is we decided we would allow negative offer prices. We're not going to impose the prices on them. They're going to tell us. Number 2, we're not going to tell them the line limits in advance. We're not going to say you can only do K over 2, you can do K over 2. Remember that first problem? We were not rationing capacity on price? Well, now we're going to ration it on price. We're going to use their offers and ration the capacity that way. And then third, this is what happens in the real world of market design. Behavioral economists keep reinforcing how important this is. We can't just do this and put it in a manual and assume it'll work. We actually went out and talked to them. And we said, by the way, we think it would be good if you actually participated in the auction and gave us price and quantities, and if you're willing to sell at a negative price, go ahead and do so. But you might want to do this, because if you're only willing to sell at a price of minus 10 and somebody else puts in a price of minus 50, we'll set the price at minus 50, we might, and you might lose your shirt. So this becomes actually efficient for them to say, oh, thank you, I'm glad you told me this. But you have to do that outreach. This is just real world economics. It's important to note, if you go back over this to think about this, these changes have very interdependent marginal incentives. The first one by itself would probably not have much effect if we hadn't done 2 and 3. The second wouldn't actually be technically feasible unless we had done 1 and 3, and so on. All these had to go. That was sort of the tricky part of figuring this all out. What happens? People love seeing bids and auctions. So let me tell you how wind supply bids. This is more recent data. It's not dissimilar from what occurs in other parts of the country, though I don't have access to their data. On the vertical axis is price and usual. On the horizontal axis is quantity. Each step is an offer from an individual wind plant at a particular point in time. This is for 11 to 11:05 on 3 July 2017. To give you oriented in units, the horizontal axis is megawatts. At the right is 1,000. In New England, average household electricity use is that will correspond to electricity use of about 1 million households. So if the wind is blowing hard and all these offers are being struck to their maximum limits, and we're getting this much wind power, that'll run the power on average for about 1,000 households. That is a lot. In all of New England, there are only about 6 million households. But what's striking is it's on the vertical axis. Look at their offer prices. A quarter of them are willing to offer at minus 150. That is, they will pay $150 for the privilege of having somebody consume their power. And then this farm at minus 100 and all the way up. A whole bunch that run in right around 80 and then all the way up. And just a handful of them are actually positive numbers from wind. This is characteristic of how wind bids. The reason they're largely negative is because of the subsidies. A very rich cavalcade of subsidies at both the state and federal levels to wind farms, to actually build wind farms and to maximize their productive output. Okay. In New England, there's a combination of the federal production tax credit, it's about $23, and then there's a whole lot of incentives under the contracts done under the renewable portfolio standards that are very complicated swaps the way they work, but the net effect is the contract price gives you an incentive to offer to run, and you get paid a premium over the spot electricity price. So if you had a contract price of 6, and that's the premium over the spot price that you will keep at the end of the day, then if the spot price was 0, you'd still be willing to sell because you make 6. Or I should say 60, actually. I'm dividing by 10 on for today. If the spot... Actually, it's because these contracts go beyond just what the REX markets do. Right? The REX markets could be made efficient, though that's another lecture. The contracts pay well more than what the value of the RECs are. And they have very different vintages, which is why you see heterogeneity here. Yeah. Good question. Thank you for clarifying that. So, given that, they really aren't willing to sell at minus infinity, and there's quite a lot of heterogeneity in what they're willing to sell, this is what we ended up seeing once we put those 3 design changes into practice. Again, same blue demand curve. This is back to my toy model, right? Same blue demand curve at B. Line limit hasn't changed. It's still at K. I assumed in this example 2 wind farms. So they put in offers at whatever they were willing to sell at. Notice that's both below 0, so they're negative numbers. And they're different offer prices because typically the wind farms rarely all have the same contractual arrangements and the same efficiencies of the turbines, so they offer slightly different prices. And now, what are the prices? Price at A is set by the marginal offer at A, set by a wind farm, negative in this example. Price at B, as before, is set by the marginal offer at location B. Line is fully congested. There's congestion revenue. It's actually bigger than before because the wind owners are actually willing to pay more than just 0, and certainly more than the old, in my prior example, non-renewable energy suppliers were willing to pay to use the line. Who gets the congestion revenue? The line owner. Lots of incentives to expand the line. Okay. Kind of restored most of the efficiency properties. I am embarrassed to say how long it took us to figure this out. And I have to tell you a real world about theory and practice, which is these things are not just academic. People built a lot of wind farms in places that they probably had very little economic value. And some of them today hardly ever run. And I think that's part because the price signals were not right. It makes a difference. It's also the case that we and one other part of the country were the first ones to sort of figure this out and rewrite the software to do this. It hasn't been done everywhere, so this problem persists elsewhere. Has not quite been fully implemented everywhere. Before I take questions, just a second, I want to note 2 things. Some of you study industrial organization and market behavior, and some of you have studied auction theory. I want to give you 2 caveats. I can't say this is perfect, which is my bullet, which says this usually works well. Doesn't always. Times when it clearly doesn't, at least if the wind power knows it does. If there's only one wind farm behind the constraint, what do you think? How do you think they change their offer bids? Anybody want to guess? This is like, all of you who are students, you're like undergraduates or PhDs, right? Because the MBAs, they would be like on this in a minute because they know how to extract rents out of an inefficient design. Those are actually all the people who are participants in my market. I go to them, they look like MBAs 20 years later. That's like who bids in these markets. Did someone want to say? Yeah, but you don't actually jack up the price. What do you do with the quantity? You back off, suppose there's one, you back off the quantity to just a pinch below K, if you knew K. Because then where will the price be? It'll go back to the top, and you capture all the congestion revenue again. If there's only one seller, you can internalize that, if you know what K is. In some sense, I haven't worried about that over the long term, because what typically happens in those cases is if there's only one farm and one line, is the wind farm will vertically integrate and buy that line segment, because it's the only one using that thing. It's like the small company buys the short line railway that connects to the main thing, because it will internalize all the benefits of that short little segment. And then it's all one company getting the same revenue. So that works out fine. So in a very Coasian sort of way, I told myself I'd promise to work coasts into this sometime today, being back in Chicago. The organization of ownership of property rights will take care of that in that case. There's another much more subtle thing if you do auction theory, which is we discovered, like we were doing totally the wrong thing in announcing the line limits, and that still happens in other parts of the country. It really helps not to announce K. And that's actually kind of subtle. So if you study auction theory, this is more what's done at graduate school than, although some undergraduate courses will do this. There is a literature that talks about if you're running a procurement auction, I got a bunch of sellers who are going to bids, and I'm a buyer. It's very important for me as a buyer to have a reserve price, at a price at which I will walk away and not award the contract at all. One of the more subtle parts of that literature is there's a general conclusion, not always, but general conclusion, that it's also important, or at least in my interest, to not announce what that reservation price is. I want to keep it to myself. Because if I announce it and relatively few suppliers show up, or especially if I need more than one supplier to actually meet my demands, they have an incentive potentially to try to bid just below my walkaway price, extract my rents. Mathematically, it's precisely analogous to the problem I just described when there's one or sometimes few sellers here. If you don't tell them K, it becomes very difficult for them to withhold K minus epsilon of the quantity. And they're dissuaded from doing so because if they try to withhold, especially if there's two sellers anyway, if they try to withhold or supply a little bit and they didn't get K right, then their competitor just cleans their clock and makes more sales and they don't capture any revenue. So we don't announce K anymore. And I can tell you, if you do market design for a living, take every auction theory class you can. Be the best eager beaver brown-nosing student you can. Because if you don't know stuff like that comes out of that literature, it makes a real difference in the real world. So. No, it's very dynamic. It depends on weather, temperature, physics of the power grid, lots of stuff that's very hard for them to know. Yeah, they do try to figure it out. We don't tell them. They will know, this person will know if they offered, say, 60% of K, let's imagine K is 100. This party will know you got cleared for 100. This party will know you got cleared for 40. This party doesn't know what this guy got cleared. We never announce that, even like not to anybody, and vice versa. So it can be hard to back out of your positions what K is. Sometimes people, it's actually a company, bugs me a little. Ever heard of a company called Genscape? Genscape has a business model, but among other things, they go out, they've hired a bunch of physicists to figure out how to put magnetometers under lines. And they monitor it in real time, and they go back to people like this, and they sell that real-time data. Real company. Now, I got to give them credit. It's really clever. And you can get in a lot of trouble taking a magnet under a power line. Do you guys ever walk under a power line and like hold a tube, like a fluorescent tube? You know what it does? It turns bright. You know what happens if you're standing too high or it's really rainy? That is the last thing you will ever do. If you take magnets under this, that's a little, I was like, oh, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stick with my pencils back at the ISO. Yeah. There were a couple questions. Let me just do one more slide, because then I'm going to break before the next example, if I could. Just to round out, because people love data, here's an example of a pricing that we see, sort of not atypically, really, on kind of summer days now. This is from June 11th, and there's no particular reason to pick that day. This is 5-minute price. This is a particular location in central Massachusetts, all day, midnight to midnight. And what we see is prices walk around with starting around 3 a.m., they go negative. So there's negative bids setting the price at this location. This is a location where there's lots of firms that can deliver power to this one location. So there's lots of different suppliers setting the price over the course of time. They're going negative and getting more and more negative as you get toward the very low point of the day, and then in morning pickup, prices come back up, and there's gas plants on the margin during the middle of the day. There's a lot of sun here. Although demand is going up, there's a lot of solar productivity. You get right around here and the sun goes down and people come home and they turn on the air conditioner and demand goes shooting, net demand, net of solar, goes shooting right up. And we get big price spikes, almost that with the sign change. But they're short, they last a little while, and then demand falls off. And we're back down to essentially the marginal cost of Marcellus gas in the evening. So, okay, there were a couple, let me just check time, 6:27, 40. Okay, let's do a couple quick questions. Yes, there are. Yep, that congestion revenue gets then sold off through another set of auctions that trade a swap against that uncertain congestion revenue for a fixed payment and reallocates that congestion revenue in a very slick, risk-sharing way that every economist loves, and people who don't do it generally don't understand, but you clearly do. So it's a great question. Nope. This tells you where the payments that go to the FTR holders get their money. They get that congestion revenue. So the default is it goes to the line owner, but the reality is it goes into an auction where it gets sold off to whoever wants it, and the line owner gets generally the fixed payment for that. They could just take the money, but generally they prefer the fixed payment by selling off the congestion revenue to whoever values it the most, which often, if there's only one person behind the line, is the wind farm. Yeah. Good question. Yes. Exactly. Yep. What I didn't show you here is something that's a little more sophisticated to deal with uncertainty. Today, we don't necessarily give them exactly what we seen in that picture. If we think the wind will pick up in the next 5 minutes and if they're economic clearing, I have to change the graph. Just thinking, that's a great question. That's complicated. Let me see if I can do it quickly. Imagine that there's a whole bunch of suppliers and that their supply just ended right here economically, and that's where we stopped. But we thought over the next, that's all they offered in. No uncompetitive, that's just what they thought the wind would blow. But the forecast that we thought is the wind could blow a lot more. We will actually not tell them you're only cleared to produce that limited amount. You have to go to exactly that for the next 5 minutes. We will actually tell them this is what you cleared, but you can produce more over the next 5 minutes if you'd like because you're a long way away from the constraint. So we will give them an individual estimate of how much more they can do. We have an algorithm to parcel that out. And they're allowed to do more, and if they do more, they will get paid for the extra. The wind firms love that. That is very complicated because you have to work out how do you parcel out the space left on the line. That's a pretty new thing we did. Yeah, good question. You have been doing your homework because that doesn't exist many places yet.
I was going to ask how much specifically, you have 5-minute pricing, so there's
Yep.
only a price signal every 5 minutes, but
Yep.
it must take them longer than 5 minutes to set a brake on a turbine to stop producing.
Oh, yeah.
So there's some mismatch between the time scale on which you'd like to send price signals and balance supply and the time scales on which you could actually adjust their supply.
There can be. Generally what happens is if you have that, so they don't set a brake, but there's inertial effects that will lead, if your turbine running at 12 and we say go to 10, you won't instantly go there, you'll go down a little bit. What we do is we allow them to give us rates at which they can go up or down from wherever they currently are, and we use them in the clearing so that they would not get a new position that's not feasible over the 5-minute period. That means if they were at 12 and they could go down to 10 within 5, they might get a clearing to go to 10. And what we'd actually see is them going, usually not quite linear, but close to linear, from the 12 to 10 over the 5 minutes.
So this is all enabled by the fact that they're not synchronous anymore.
No, they're fully synchronous when they're doing this.
They can,
Yep, gas turbines are all electronically controlled.
no, the wind turbines can.
Oh, the wind.
They can ramp down their power.
Yeah, they feather the blades.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's relatively new wind technology, but very common.
yeah.
Very common.
That makes the market a lot easier.
Yeah, the wind turbine reacts really fast. Wind turbines at 80, and then for the next economically, we tell them go to literally 30. A normal turbine won't go that fast. They will just take the blades and they literally go. Whoop. So it's like a ship that's in irons, and it just the inertia of the rotor will slow down, and it's very good control technologies. We have nothing to do with that. That's just people who build wind turbines are really good at that stuff nowadays. All right, let me go over here.
Has this process been adopted by companies like Uber and other market-oriented demand-supply type organizations besides electricity?
I would like to take credit for that. I think a more honest answer is there are many other places in the economy where the same phenomenon is going on, but we're all sort of working from the same fundamental economic principles and seeing same problems in disguise of different applications. So the classic one, Uber was the first one to come up with scarcity pricing for essentially taxi services. It is exactly the sort of congestion revenue that I showed you in the first example. They came up with it on their own. I didn't. But when I learned about Uber scarcity pricing in a podcast called Planet Money. Planet Money is great, right? If you never took economics, you'll learn like most of your undergraduate economics if you just listen to all those couple hundred Planet Moneys. And I remember thinking, wow, it's the exact same thing. And they did it before we did, so maybe not before the 15 years, though. Yeah, it's the same idea. There are other applications. The one that's most promising is for roads. There's actually an article in today's Wall Street Journal about that in New York City, or efforts in New York City. I'm cross my fingers, but I don't deal with road pricing, so I don't have an answer. Yeah. Let me move on a little bit to the next example. Is that okay? All right. Okay. Intermittency of renewables is a great concern about much of what has been written. I want to talk to you a little bit about information aggregation. It is a real thing. The issue is not to prevent it. The issue is how can you best make markets adjust to reduce the costs that it imposes. Day-ahead wind and solar output is very uncertain. Markets will work much better if we have better information in advance about what its actual output will be the next day. That's because everything else other than the wind takes time to adjust on a day-ahead time frame. If the wind's not going to blow, other things that take 3 or 4 hours to start up, like gas turbines, take a couple hours to start up. But if the wind turns out to blow unexpectedly hard, those turbines will lose all their spot sales in the real-time market, but they will have burned a lot of fuel to start up and be sitting there at idle, essentially, as they call it, burning money, right? That is terribly inefficient. They never should have started up, with hindsight. So the more information you have, the more efficient it can be. I want you to think now that this really involves 2 problems, and economists would parcel the core issues here into these categories. One is a matter of prediction or forecasting. Can we get higher quality information, less variance, in our expectations about what will happen tomorrow, about the root uncertain thing? How much will wind farms be able to produce tomorrow? But that's not the only thing. You actually have to figure out, to be efficient in a market context, how do you take better information, and whoever might have it, and get it into the decisions of all the other people, the non-wind producers, so that they make more efficient production decisions about when to start up or to not start up the assets that they own. Because the value of production from those assets will be very different tomorrow. The spot price will be very different, depending on what the wind farms do. What's really striking is that there are 2 very different approaches emerging to this problem. One is sequential retrading markets. I'll explain that next. It's emerging in Europe. And the second, in the US, is a centralized forecasting service mandate that the federal regulators have decided is the way that we should do this sort of thing. And I want to explain them each and leave you with a real problem, which is which one is better? Because I'm not sure, but I am sure the answer can't be they are equal. They are very different. So, sequential retrading. I'm going to explain this in the context of what's called the Iberian electricity market. That's essentially Spain and Portugal. And Koshiro Ito, who's here, assistant professor here at Chicago, did some of the most interesting work on this recently. I'll give a shout out to him and his co-author in a moment. In the Iberian market, they have a day-ahead forward market, much like the one I just described. Then they will run rebalancing markets. Every 4 hours, after about noon day ahead, they'll run another market. And all the participants, wind and others, can bid in to sell more, and they can adjust their bid prices or to buy out their forward positions in each sequential market, all the way leading up to the actual real-time 5-minute pricing. What we see in practice is that the wind producers systematically adjust their forward positions. They might have sold this much day ahead. This is, let's just say we knew what they're actually going to produce in real time. They will just, next auction, they'll buy a little bit. Next auction, they'll buy a little bit. And they get all the way down till, in the last auction, 4 hours out before real time, they're very close to what they're actually going to do. Okay? That serves the coordination role. Because as they're buying out, who's the counterparty on the other side of that market? If they're buying out an intraday market, somebody must be selling more. The selling more is somebody who owns another kind of generator. So they may not have sold anything day ahead, but in an intraday market, now they sold. Now they got a forward position to cover, so they start up their generator to run in real time. If the wind farms are buying out their positions, getting down it very accurately to what they're actually going to do, the generators, the other generators, not knowing anything about the wind or caring about it directly, will end up financially taking the opposite positions and lining up exactly with how much they should produce, so they don't have the inefficiencies of unnecessary expensive generators running that aren't needed, or worse yet, the wind thing is going to be there, everybody thinks it's going to be there, and it isn't, and there's not enough generation to meet demand. I want to note something. There's something in economics called the local information problem. When we tend to think markets will do a very good job at coordination that otherwise might not occur without these kind of trading opportunities, a general way to think about it is that will often be the case when the people who are actually entering initially wanting to rebalance, the wind producers have information that's not known by everybody. If it's known by everybody else, then some financial arbitrager will just take care of this for us. But if the wind farms know it, and the wind farms do have lots of local information, they have little anerometers, the wind speed things on all of their towers, and every ridge is different from the other ridge, is different from the next producer. So if you know your wind speed here and its trajectory over the last 90 minutes, you can do a better job of predicting what's going to happen at your farm over the next 4 hours than anybody else can. Okay, so they know that and other people don't. This chart is from a paper by Ito and Raguant. This is in the American Economic Review in 2016. I use it with due credit because it's actually very hard to get data that illustrate this phenomenon. Certainly you can't get in the US because no one does this in the US yet. So the way to think about it is this is for a panel of wind farms, and we're showing how much they sold in each market relative to what they'll actually deliver. And the blue dots show that in that Iberian day-ahead market, wind farms sold somewhere this is for sort of delivery in the early pre-dawn hours, about 400 megawatts day ahead, more than what they will actually deliver on average. In the hot afternoons and towards the end of the day, they're sometimes getting up there around 500, 600, 700 megawatts more sold day ahead than what they'll actually deliver. Now you get to the first intraday market, which is these red lines. They've bought out most of their forward position, brought down their net position much closer to what they'll actually deliver. And in particular, for the prompt hours, so these are 4 hours ahead, they're very close to what they're going to deliver. Second intraday market in green, they bought out further still. Prompt hours, they're getting very close to what they'll deliver. Third intraday, they buy out further still, very close to what they're going to deliver, and so on down the line. Okay. In this, these markets are giving us both prediction information. If you know what the wind farms are doing, that's telling you what the wind farms think they're going to produce, getting closer and closer. It also serves the coordination function, because the counterparties to all the wind farms' trades are the other generators who find it financially advantageous to execute those trades and pick up an obligation to deliver. Nice system. Make sense? Looks simple, a lot of deep economics in those two concepts. US, very different. We have a day-ahead forward market and a real-time delivery market. Those are the ones we just talked about in the previous module, though at this point we'll ignore congestion for the moment. There are no intervening retraded markets for physical delivery. None of the ISOs do this yet. So the concern you get, of course, is what happens if wind unexpectedly delivers a lot more than what anybody thought it would in the day-ahead market? You can see the outcomes, right? If they're produced much more in real time, then generators that sold day-ahead but will turn out to be unneeded are sitting there burning fuel, running it idle, essentially, if you will, which is wasteful. And if they do too less, then what happens in practice is the only things that actually can start really fast are really expensive generators, things that basically look like jet engines burning jet fuel and they're incredibly expensive. And they're the only things that can start fast enough. And the prices will spike and you're running sort of the least efficient resources that exist in the power system. So the first of those is actually pretty typical, though both kind of errors are a mistake. Just to give you an example of this, in New England, this is data for all of 2017. All of those wind farms collectively sold only about 100 megawatts day ahead. That's in comparison to the 1,000 that you see offered in the real-time bid stack that I showed you. They just don't bother showing up day ahead. In real time, the way the wind actually blows, about 400 megawatts will get produced. Even though they offer in 1,000, they actually only have enough wind to produce about 400 on average. There is a lot of arbitrage of this day ahead to real time. That's not really the focus of what I wanted to emphasize here. It's rather what happens after the day ahead market if there's new information about what wind might do. So there's a lot of concern about this, and in 2012, our federal regulators decided it should be a new requirement that all ISOs should forecast the wind and the production of all the wind farms in their regions, which we now do. They also put an obligation on the wind farms to send us their local data feeds. So that local knowledge, exactly how much wind is blowing at the top of every tower, they have to give us that very fast, like every 5 minutes. Detailed wind stream data. We use it to build a forecasting model of what the wind will do. In practice, these models, by my standards, I did econometrics early in my career. If I got models that made these kinds of predictions and things that actually make differences in real money, I thought that would be great. So day ahead, the prediction is sort of within plus or minus 12%. And intraday, the interesting thing is as we go to the intraday, it almost doesn't get any better, which is a very interesting physical phenomenon. Koshiro tells me that's also true in other markets that I haven't seen. And so I want to point that out and then get back to this question about whether all this activity and regulation is really going to help much. This is our estimates of wind forecasts. This is for February, actually just last month. Each blue line is an individual wind farm. There's about 37 of them there. We forecast every wind farm's output starting 36 hours in advance all the way to real time. On the vertical axis is not our forecast, but it is the error of our forecast. This is the mean absolute error, or otherwise known as the L1 error in mathematics. And what you see in the solid line is what happens on average. The key thing to take away here is 36 hours out, we have an average error. It's a little more than 12%. You get all the way down here, and that line is almost flat on average, and for most plants. Are we learning any new information from 36 hours out to 10 hours? Nothing, not this way. In Spain, did the wind farms learn new information between Dayahead and the first intraday, which was only 4 hours later? They sure did, because they had a pretty big financial stake to figure it out. I don't know what they're doing, but we aren't that successful. And I can tell you, we spend an awful lot of money. We probably spend more money than the wind farms have in Spain to try to do this stuff, right? It doesn't actually get any better till we get right about 3 hours. It starts to get better, and then by the time we get 1 hour, that's where this graph ends. It's actually clearly getting the accuracy on average is getting much better. But even there, it's only about 10 to about 10%. You drop from 12% to 10%. That's like nothing in real units. Not much. So you're not learning much. So now think about, suppose you try to use this to coordinate the production of all the other sellers. Are you given anything useful to them between day ahead and real time? How about for the first until you get to 3 hours out? Not really. Nonetheless, there's a great debate in this industry about what should be done about this under the US model. Here are two approaches. These are not the only approaches under discussion in the industry, but these are kind of the bookends. We do one of them, that's alternative one. We take all those forecasts and we just post them publicly. So here you go. We can't give you the individual wind farms data. That's commercially sensitive information, that's their stuff, but we'll give you our forecast for the system as a whole. Let you make your own decisions. So then someone who owns a gas turbine who might not have sold day ahead because he didn't clear, didn't look like he would be needed, sees the forecast shows the wind is actually not going to be there, he can privately decide, I want to start up. He can start up his unit. Once you start it up, he can offer it in the real-time market. Or alternatively, if he sees the forecast is going to go the other way and he had cleared day ahead, he might call us up and say, I'm not going to start my plan at all. I'm going to cash out my day ahead positions to the real-time price, come what may. Because he thinks he'll make money, because he thinks there'll be a lot of wind, which means lots of extra supply in real time. That's low priced, negatively priced, means he'll buy out at a profit. Now, I can tell you our hope is that that is as efficient as what you see in the Spanish market. But I can't tell you that's a theorem, much as I'd like it to be. It's more of a, what I'll call a hoping strategy as a conclusion basis for research. There's a very different approach that's going on. It's been proposed by our counterpart organization in California, no affiliation to it, but it does the same rollout in the West. And they felt that this is entirely too decentralized and trusting of everybody else to know what to do, and there's no basis to believe that that is as good as what they could do, which is interesting perspective. They've decided that, and they've talked to their stakeholders now about becoming a market maker where in the day-ahead market they will buy real options. So in addition to energy trading day-ahead, they will step in as a market maker and buy options from generators who didn't clear that give them the right to tell a generator start up, say 3 hours out or 2 hours out or 15 minutes out. Or other generators that did start up, they'll buy put options to tell them we're going to tell you to shut down 2 hours out, 3 hours out, or 15 minutes out. When there's no market at that time, they're going to make the decision based on their forecasts. And the amount of options they buy obviously would be based on their estimates of what's the average difference between what clears wind day ahead and what they're forecast of on that particular day. The issue that has become quite a challenging question for this industry is which one is better. The sort of sequential market design that we're seeing emerging in Europe and in practice in the Iberian market, or this centralized forecasting and its various variations of it that is either in practice And then some of the coordination stuff is still emerging. One of the core ideas in economics that we like about markets is something called the wisdom of the crowds. If you really believe something, right, the simple idea, if you really believe something, put your money where your mouth is, right? And that's what that Iberian design has tried to do. In the US design, there is no wisdom of the crowds aggregating information after the day-ahead market, before the real time. But there's definitely information that arrives as you get close to the real time, right? Those 3 to 2 to 1 hours. And maybe even more, it's just we're not good enough to get it. I think that's entirely possible. But a contrary view is to say, yeah, but the reason the wisdom of the crowds might be really useful is because there's local information. In Spain, nothing disseminates that local information, but here we do. So how much better could they do other than just using what we post and following, say, the method, alternative one I just described? Let them make their own decisions, give them the aggregate results of the private information. I don't know the answer to this question. I wish I did, because a lot of money hangs on this, and a lot of inefficiencies could be resolved if we had better information. So I will, since this is a university, I'm going to say empirical research here would be really valuable. Because time will surely answer this, but just like with congestion pricing, time is money. If we go a long time without the right answer, a lot of losses could occur. This I added at the last minute. This is an homage to Canis Prendergast. Do any of you guys know Canis here? Do you know about the free food experiment? Any of you? There's a group called Free Food for America that was having a huge misallocation problem, figuring out how to allocate food. And a bunch of UC professors were asked, what do you think of that? And they said, well, obviously you need a market. And this is Free Food for America. These are people who feed homeless shelters, and they had a socialist bent, and they said, well, we don't like markets. That's just unfair. But some of the colleagues here were successful in convincing them otherwise. They built an eBay-like system. And there is a fantastic podcast all about this, which is hyperlinked on this. I'm told these are up on the web. And it is a great idea. And it was an experiment that is all about information economics and local knowledge, where they created trading markets to aggregate information and get to much better outcomes. And so I think perhaps those of you who like doing experimental economics, maybe that's the right thing to do to help us get answers to this. I am hesitant to do an experiment on these people because there's billions of dollars at stake. It would be nice to have some research first, right? So, okay. See, I got 17 minutes left to go. I'm sure there are questions. I want to get through this, which is kind of cool. Are there any questions on that last module before I proceed? Yep. I believe there, so I don't know that. In the paper that Koshiro did, he argues that both statements are true. Those are not inconsistent objectives, right? One is a means to achieve the other. To document one of the things I asserted, which is they're getting close to the real-time positions, you can show in that data that those real-time positions are actually what they produced. You have to look at other data, which shows what they actually produced, and he has that data. I didn't show you that here, so you're right to question me on that. There are, I don't know if they're 5 minute. There are real-time markets, but I don't think they're 5 minutes. I think they do real-time and they close out hourly. And they have something called a balancing market, which is a discriminatory market for the what we call true real-time. Yeah, slightly different institutional arrangement in the real-time setup. I'm not the expert in that market, but the expert who is here. But he's not able to be here with us tonight. Okay. I want to talk last about solar. This is a short thing. I think there's only 5 slides on this, but it's a vexing problem about new technologies. First, I want to tell you a little bit about an externality, what I call the fundamental externality of electricity. This is what makes electricity to an economist very different from other goods. Supply and demand, if they don't match exactly at every point in time, the product, that is electricity as a product, its quality suffers. Not just for the marginal buyer and seller, for everyone. The physics behind this is that electricity on the power grid travels in waves, nice sinusoidal waves, right? 60 hertz, 60 cycles per second. If supply exceeds demand, too much push, those waves get closer together, the frequency goes up. over 60. If supply is insufficient relative to demand at the speed of light, those waves stretch out. Frequency gets longer, lower than 60. This is huge. All your electronics are designed to run at 60.0 to a lot of decimal places. If this gets off by more than a tiny bit, no more iPhones. Your laptops don't work for a reason that is not due to Microsoft. Massive externalities across the economy. This is how cascading blackouts occur when these things get off by just more than like several decimal places, actually. Super accurate, has to be. So this is the core issue is prices, if we're going to use a market, has got to coordinate supply and demand really accurately. You cannot balance supply and demand the way it works by General Motors or for Coke, where the seller makes a forecast of demand, decides how much they want to produce, picks a price, sees how much sells, sees the excess inventory or the insufficient supply, makes an adjustment to their production decisions to manage excess supply. That little bit where they produce too much and so there's excess supply, that's a disaster. Can't happen. Market design has to be such that the prices make the buyers and sellers want to do exactly the right thing. Okay? And that is the core rationale for why we use auctions instead of finding prices the way GM figures out how to price its cars, which I still don't understand. This is actually easier, but that's okay. Okay. 5 minutes. That was good enough in the power grids in the North America, at least 20 years ago, to keep that coordinated to the tolerances we require, with a little bit of adjustments I'll talk about in just a moment. That's where 5 minutes comes from. Okay. Now, solar arrives. Solar is much newer than wind at commercial grid scale. Okay. This is the last couple of years. Solar output is really variable over very short time intervals. I'll show you that on the next slide. Think not minutes, think seconds. Big changes. Demand, and so nothing else on the grid is like that. No other generation technology. Wind has inertia because the rotor's moves much more gradually. Demand, that's everything consumers use, varies relatively smoothly over the course of the day. Certainly doesn't vary much on a course of second to second. Markets, for the reasons I just told you, have to coordinate all the other producers' production to balance the fluctuations at very high frequencies that solar produces today. Otherwise, things don't work. The frequency excursions. There are a bunch of technologies that can do this. These kind of things can happen even before we had solar if there's like a disturbance to the grid or a lightning tower hit a thing. There's certain types of hydroelectric generators and modern gas turbine generators that can respond on the scale of seconds if so instructed. They can't go a long way, but if you have a lot of them and you ask a lot of them to do a little bit within a matter of 3 or 4 seconds, they can react. Batteries, these new lithium-ion batteries, they are great for this. They can do large injections of power, or the other way, they can charge and draw power off the grid almost instantaneously. This is a new facility that just went in the other year in part of New England. It's a very large battery complex, and it was built. This is just private investors trying to make money off doing this kind of a service. And in the future, might not need this, because we might all have those. And the thing that's actually in those cases, technologically, is the exact same thing that's in a Nissan Leaf. Except the controller electronics is a little different, because this guy's trying to react to what's going on in seconds, and this one's not. That's just software. At least while they're plugged in, right? So, why do you care about how to think about using prices to coordinate production in a way to make advantage of possibly all of this new technology coming along, and this technology that's already here? It's because of this. I'll let you absorb that for a moment. Real data, last summer. This is a large sort of solar farm in central Massachusetts. During this time of year, the yellow curve shows what its production would be with perfectly crystal clear weather. Okay, so the maximum output over 30 days. Sun rises here, its production ramps up, levels out across the middle of the day, and it drops back off as the sun sets here about 8 p.m. The blue is what this unit actually produced that day. Those drop-offs occurred like this. It was a cloudy day, partly cloudy day, but this is New England. We have cloudy or full cloudy days 70% of the year. This is not unusual. These magnitudes are enormous. Those are megawatts at one solar array. 12 megawatts is more than 1 million people on average, the power consumed by about 1 million homes. You get a drop like this, which occurred more or less, again, very, very short time scales. When it dropped from about 11 to about 4, that's a drop of about 7. Think of that as the amount of power that's being used by 700,000 households. Disappeared like that. If you don't want the frequency to have an unacceptable excursion, somebody else has to do what? Whoop! Now, engineers long ago realized this could happen if, for example, a nuclear power unit had a lightning strike, and so they developed a method to do this, which is still in use today, and it is not based on economics. It's a very command and control system at this time scales. Here is a very simple example. Imagine a solar unit drops, I guess I use 9 megawatts here in this example. To balance the frequency, we want other suppliers to go up by 9 megawatts as fast as can possibly happen. Think seconds. Ceteris paribus here means let's hold demand constant. Okay, demand is just unchanged. The way we do it today is select suppliers who say they're willing and able to do this. We ask them how fast can you respond. This is measuring on the essentially seconds, megawatts per second timescale. Imagine a battery said they can go twice as fast as a fast generator. Then if you wanted to recover from this as fast as possible, you'd ask the battery to do twice as much. Because the battery will do twice as much, 6 in this example, and take, if it can go 2 megawatts a second, it'll take 3 seconds to get there. And if the fast generator can go only half the speed, 1 megawatt per second, it'll go up 3, it'll take 3 seconds to get there. 3 seconds, you've recovered. Okay. This algorithm, been around for a long time. It's actually control in the true scientific sense of optimal control theory. It comes from, it's the same ideas actually as rocket control. Like rockets. Who cared about the cost? Right? There's no cost going on here. Not great if you think maybe the right way to do this is not to have this battery and that generator do it, but to have 60,000 cars do 6 divided by 60,000, and you want to give them an incentive to want to have their cars do this, which means you need to pay them, but you should pay them a price, and the price better reflect the value of this service, which doesn't exist. No mechanism, no market design discovers a market price for this service today. Which is really where I'm going to leave you on this issue. This has become such an interesting problem that there's enormous discussion of it, and by my measure, no real useful economic progress on the answer. Though there's lots of engineering progress that shows this is actually possible with EVs now. We call this the prices to devices. No human being is going to sit there going, oh, yep, I'm in, turn my car up. Right, this has got to be all programmed into your car and everything else, but in a way that you're willing to have your car do this and willing to have something in there that tells, don't let my car do this right now, I have to go out to the grocery store, get more milk or diapers. It is not obvious how to create a price discovery mechanism that will find the prices for this service. And there's some really hard trade-offs because you don't want to just do it solely based on willingness to pay. You also want this to occur fast, which means you can trade off cost versus speed of response. But what's the value of the speed of response? Speed of response in the aggregate has value because it reduces the frequency excursions, which are an externality. It's not obvious there exists a market mechanism that can elucidate society's willingness to pay for faster speed of response. If I was Vickery, Groves, and Clark, I might know how to do that. But that's another joke for the PhD students. But I don't. I'm hoping somebody does. But technologically, the engineers have already done these really cool demonstration projects where they show, yeah, 1,000 batteries, if you put the right software in them, they can definitely do this. At least it works on the existing control signal. It's definitely technologically feasible. And the other thing that's kind of cool, people always worry about range anxiety, and it's not a concern here because that 5-minute auction market, if you got a bunch of 1,000 cars doing this and they all got a signal to go up, which means they have to discharge the batteries, which means they have to drain the batteries in the car, half of them could just do it for 5 minutes. And then in the 5-minute auction, we could just rebalance the grid and charge them right back up with the next 5. So no one would have an excursion that lasts longer than 10 minutes. So you could have your, if it's built into your car, have it pre-programmed to do this, but make sure you always stop doing this before 6 a.m. because I go to work at 6:30. Right? That would work. It's very dense. And the cool thing, if you have prices, if you own the car, you might get paid because your car could provide a valuable service balancing out that solar fleet. Kind of cool, huh? So if you like this stuff and you think market design is neat, and you are comfortable studying auction theory and all the heavy math that's hidden behind this stuff that you kind of got to know to not make mistakes like leaving out a constraint and having wind power built in the wrong place. This is a great market design challenge. And if you're a graduate student and you're entering that third year dark phase where you're not quite sure what to do with your dissertation and you're wandering around, you should never wander around if you have any interest in this, because there are so many real world problems that are so close to price theory and have so much practical importance that we don't have the answers to. And it would be wonderful to have more research so we don't have to just live with things that don't work as efficiently as they should any longer. With that, I want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. It has been a true pleasure. I see there may be a couple minutes, so I'm happy to take a few questions before we break.
What about the role of demand response now and as all this technology changes in the future?
I think it has enormous potential. I would like to think it should work a lot more the way demand response works for you buying gasoline, where you just see a price signal and you choose to use it or not. I don't think, realistically, that's again another prices devices thing. I think in the real world, I don't think people are going to follow what's going on in a wholesale market with 1,000 prices and everything and run home and do their thermostats, but they may well program them in advance to cut back more so if it's really hot, especially if you leave your house in the middle of the day. I think that's down the road, mostly because of institutional constraints. State regulators in most states have been very hesitant to expose consumers to high prices in spot markets, which is what would motivate them to buy the technology from Nest and all these others, the technology exists, and put it on their houses. That looks to me a lot like the challenges of getting congestion pricing on roads. It's the same kind of political constraint. Definitely technologically doable. Lots of potential in theory.
Do you think markets will adapt or change with the new cryptocurrencies that are emerging? Do you see any change with that?
I don't know.
I've read a couple of articles that they're starting to do like buying and trading on cryptos that.
Yep. Let me break that into two things. Alternative currencies and blockchain. I don't think alternative currencies is directly bearing on this because that's just a medium of exchange, whatever it is. Blockchain is different. I hear two different views on blockchain. One is it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. When I looked at it, it looked a lot like a double ledger accounting system and not much more than what we teach in the introductory undergraduate accounting, with the need to keep track of everything else that ever happened since the dawn of time to get the current balance sheet, which seems like an accounting device rather than a true innovation to facilitate trading. Like it's a settlement simplification, possibly. We have to do lots of settlement technology to settle all this money. If there was a better way to do that, we would probably adopt it. So I don't know about that going forward. That is an interesting question. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you so much for your patience. It's been a true pleasure to come see you all. Thank you so much.